Thursday, July 8th, 2009, interviewing Robert M. Fisher for the Lafayette Library Oral History Project. And we'll begin by asking if you have some early childhood memories of libraries. Do you?
I sure do. My sweetest memories are of visits from our summer cottage on White Bear Lake, Minnesota, which is a suburb of St. Paul, where I grew up, where a little old lady who looked like the grandmother or mother in the Bates Motel, who was probably 30 years old, but she looked like a little old lady to me, would point me to new things that I might be interested in, like the Oz series. As soon as I got hooked by the first Frank Oz book, she set aside every other one, and I read through them, coming in and out with my own dear library card, my mom bringing me every few days to replace the books, and it was very sweet. I must have been quite young. I would guess that I was probably 6, 7, 8 years old, and those memories have always stuck with me.
Sounds lovely. And Minnesota then was where you grew up?
I grew up in Minnesota, yes.
And I have a question here about being aware of community as you were a young person. Did your family life interact with community involvement?
Yes, my dad was a refugee and my mom was an immigrant. So that my sisters and I were first generation Americans. And my parents could never get over the miracle of America. So that they were extremely involved in community. They were, when they could afford to be, philanthropic. As my sisters grew up, they were very involved in local volunteer activities. In fact, one of my high school presents when I graduated from my older sisters was a membership in the League of Women Voters.
Interesting.
And this was in 1956, so it was rare for a man to be a member of the League of Women Voters, and I've been a member now for over 50 years, wow. 53 years. I've been a member of the League of Women Voters. Regular visitors to our homes when I was a youngster were people like Eugene McCarthy and Don Fraser and Hubert Humphrey, who found my family and its values extremely open to their forms of politics. Harold Stassen, a Republican, was also a very active family friend, and it really was the involvement of my family in St. Paul, Minneapolis that got me immediately involved when my wife and I moved to the Bay Area.
Tremendous influences on a young life, all of those personalities, yes. Can you tell us about your educational background, please, and then maybe your work experience?
I was very fortunate to have opportunities, and opportunities that through a lot of diligence, I would say, I was able to make something out of, because I was a very unusual recruit to Harvard College from St. Paul.
How so?
Because in my draft board, in my local draft board, I was the only one who went to an Ivy League school. And it was because the principal of my school came to me one day and he said, "Bob, I know where you should go to school. And he said, and I said, where? And he told me Harvard College. I said, I'd heard of it. Where is it?
Yes.
So I was fairly naive about those things, but I had a wonderful, wonderful time in college. Stayed in Boston after my bachelor's degree to complete a degree at the Harvard Law School, and then was encouraged by one of my mentors, for whom I was a research assistant at the Harvard Law School, to pursue a PhD at the London School of Economics and Political Science, which I finished in the mid-60s. And it was that combination of incredible educational opportunities that was my ticket to become the youngest assistant professor at Berkeley in 1965. So I was very, very fortunate to have opportunities
Indeed.
that I could take advantage
Indeed.
of.
Yes. And then your education led into your work history, I presume?
It did. I stayed on the Berkeley faculty until the early 70s. Those were very active times, as you can imagine. And was very disappointed in what I found were the values of higher education as I saw them at the great research universities, and those were, of course, the only ones to which I'd been exposed. So I left Berkeley in 71. It was 3 years later when I was recruited by another Lafayette Citizen of the Year, the remarkable Barbara Bupp, to become involved with the search committee with then defunct, unaccredited, Martinez-bound John F. Kennedy University.
Yes.
And before I knew it, I was back in higher education, really as a pioneer and icebreaker for what was then something new in America, and that was mid-career education for adults returning to complete or degrees or change careers. Meanwhile, of course, I had other careers. I had become a councilman and mayor in Lafayette in 1968, and I had been a professional athlete from 71 on, and I had a small law firm in Lafayette. I was a legal aid attorney in Richmond in 72, 73. But my main career path from Ellie's move with me here with our young daughter Lori in 65 until 1985 was in higher education.
Okay, and what attracted you to Lafayette?
Much of it was the usual coincidence. We came to Berkeley so that I could accept this professorship.
Yes.
We rented a house from a faculty member on sabbatical in Africa for a year. And after we had been here for a number of months, and we found my daughter walking around the backyard of our Berkeley house near Grizzly Peak in a snowsuit in August. Ellie said, "This is not why we moved to California. If we're staying in California, we need to find a place that is more Californian." So we went over the hill, started looking in Orinda and Lafayette and Moraga area, found a wonderful house in Upper Happy Valley, and raised our children there. Lived in Upper Happy Valley for over 20 years.
So Lafayette's been home for a long time.
Lafayette was a great home, and indeed, we only sold our home in Upper Happy Valley on North Peardale because I took an executive position with a huge agency in Manhattan, we really didn't enjoy being back in New York. So after a year, I came back to resurrect the San Francisco Foundation, which had been through a major litigation and been damaged deeply. We could not find a home in a house in Lafayette that we really liked. We happened upon a house in what I call Baja Lafayette. That's Orinda, that I liked very much, and we've been here for more than 20 years.
Oh, it's been that long.
In Baja Lafayette.
It's been that long.
But Lafayette is our town. We do everything in Lafayette.
Well, and La Marinda is La Marinda. You know, it's a composite of the three, I think, and there are cultural differences, but we see ourselves as citizens of La Marinda here, I think. Now, going on to maybe an opinion you might have about Lafayette's philosophy. If we define goals of a community as a place of mutual support, shared values, acceptance of differences, do you see Lafayette meeting those goals, or how do you see Lafayette meeting those goals?
Lafayette is a remarkable community. It was a relatively old community before its successful incorporation in 1968. It had been in business for 120 years. By then, its location between the Berkeley Hills and the center of the valley made it a place highly desirable for early settlement. And so there was quite a history in Lafayette. There were quite a number of indigenous institutions in Lafayette before our incorporation. Some of them continue today to be as strong, if not stronger, than they always were. Some of them, like the Lafayette Improvement Association, which was in effect our city government for so many years, our advocacy group to Martinez, have less of a role to play, but Lafayette was very much a community, and I think that a major force in maintaining that community was the shared emphasis on education.
Indeed.
And the value of our schools.
Indeed.
And as Lafayette being a remarkable place for traditional families to raise their children and send them to public schools. Lafayette, in 1968, I became captivated by the incorporation campaign just months after our move to Lafayette in 1966. And it was very clear to me that Lafayette shared values that were participative, inclusive, that there was a tremendous dedication to a democratic process. There was a real sense of community. The levels of volunteerism were very high. People were dedicated to local control and had a clear sense of values, so that when we adopted our first general plan in 1970, when I was mayor the first time, the language that we adopted was language that had been echoed for many years in pre-incorporation Lafayette, and now, 40-some years later, 41 years later, is still echoed in our latest revisions to the general plan.
That's remarkable, truly. Do you have any early memories of the library here in Lafayette, the old library?
I have many early memories of the old library, even though it was Ellie who was taking our children there several times a week to pick up books and return books and to do projects, because I was working elsewhere. But I remember how lovely the librarians were, how hospitable it was. In many ways, it resonated of my experience in White Bear Village, Minnesota, in that old Carnegie library. There really was a lot of attention always in our library to personal service, and with a heavy emphasis on service to young people. I might say that one of the things that influenced our early city councils, on which I served, to commit all of our block grant monies to senior services and to select the site for Chateau Lafayette was the location of the library. Not only could seniors walk easily from Chateau Lafayette to the center of town and shop, but they could walk back toward the south just for a block to go to the Lafayette Library.
Indeed. The library serves the community in many ways, and you just mentioned some, but do others come to mind?
The library is not only a repository of knowledge, and clearly, even through a small branch library like Lafayette's, as outdated as it had become over the years, we had access to the whole library system of Contra Costa County. So one could order books through the central catalog before there was the technology of the computer, and that gave us great access. But it was never just a place for dropping off, picking up books, and doing research through their resource materials. It was a social place, like Diablo Foods. The library was a place where you would meet and greet half of the community. It was a place where children saw other children reading and got the message that this was a fun thing to do. It was a place where you could take your children for a reading event and a storytelling opportunity. It was a place where teens could go after school and do the social thing when occasionally look in a book. And it was a place where seniors could hang out and go and read the morning paper and have a destination. It was really a social gathering place.
And indeed, all of those wonderful aspects we expect will be a part of the new library. All of those things will go on, will happen, continue.
Absolutely, and in fact, the work done by so many Lafayette volunteers to hone in on the site where the new library is being built, to the cooperation of the veterans in Walnut Creek and Lafayette in making it possible for us to build them a beautiful new building at another location and to make room for the new library, and of course the ambitious vision for the new library will make it a much more impactful community asset than we've ever had. And what's remarkable about it all is that it is a free library.
Yes.
The free library is very American, and the free library represents fundamental and critically important American values.
Indeed. Now we come to asking about your involvement in the development of the idea and the ongoingness of the project of the new library. So what can you tell us about that?
When I was approached, and you have the documentation about this, I think it was sometime in 2003, by Ann Appert and Gwen Lennox, to become the fundraising consultant for the new library. It was a natural. Ann Groden had been a student of mine, and Marshall, her husband, before they were married, a student of mine at Berkeley in the 60s. They'd been very active in my political campaigns. They knew me well. I knew them well. Of course, Anne Groden became, as I was, honored as a Citizen of the Year in Lafayette and was a driver behind this project. Anne had worked with me while I was the CEO of the San Francisco Foundation to create the Lafayette Community Foundation. And the Lafayette Community Foundation, with Anne Groden as its chair, was going to be handling the library campaign. When they asked the question, who should be the fundraising consultant? Well, I had brought with me some obvious credentials of which Anne was very much aware. I'd won the highest honor given by the National Society of Fundraising Executives as a fundraising professional. I raised $300 million while I was during the time I was at the San Francisco Foundation. And I had been a fundraiser since I was 15 years old. But in addition to that, I had served for 8 years in leadership in Lafayette. I'd been a Lafayette Citizen of the Year. I had raised money from almost anyone close to my age in Lafayette for various community projects. Many of the most wealthy people in Lafayette and generous were clients of mine at the San Francisco Foundation because they had funds at the San Francisco Foundation. I had been very involved in a number of local projects like California Shakespeare Theater, St. Mary's College, John Muir Medical Center, Lindsay Museum, Regional Center for the Arts, and so
You were more than a natural.
when you put it all together, and I was at that time a partner in a consulting firm where I was a licensed fundraising counsel in the state of California. So when you put it all together, it really was a natural, and of course I was eager to do this because I was not alone in my consulting partnership. I couldn't do it for nothing, but we deeply discounted my rates so that we ended up making a very considerable contribution to the library in kind by about $30,000, which meant a lot to Ellie and me.
Indeed.
So it was a great marriage.
And people responded to your efforts in that capacity, and others as well. And so we have a question that asks your opinion about the citizens of Lafayette and their response to the idea and the project of the new library. Why do you think they've been so enthusiastic?
Clearly, part of it is Lafayette. But what we know is that we haven't seen these kinds of responses in Walnut Creek or in Orinda. And the demographics of Orinda are very similar to Lafayette. There is a significant segment of the population in Walnut Creek whose demographic is similar to Lafayette's. I think that there were other factors involved, and I would say a key factor is leadership. Anne Groden, Don Tatson, Ann Appert, Gwen Lennox, the remarkable city manager we have in Steve Falk, made a very powerful nucleus for this campaign. When you put that together with what I call the big idea, none of these other communities were able to, in my opinion, excite their community with what I call the big idea.
Well, and tell us about that, please. Because that, of course, is the consortium idea, and I have a little inkling of how that happened, but tell the story, please.
That's part of it. In Walnut Creek and in Orinda, they're trying to update outdated branch libraries, and that's a great cause. But it doesn't attract the attention of suburbanites whose lives typically are in other communities. We've always had trouble in a Lafayette or Orinda getting the attention of people whose business interests are elsewhere. They're commuters, and suburban communities have a very tough time attracting major gifts from people who live in those communities because they tend to see themselves as San Franciscans in this case, or their interests are in Oakland or in San Ramon or Walnut Creek. In this case, in my opinion, it was the big idea, and it was crafting a notion that a library could be much larger than just a repository for books, a place where you would go and pick up and drop off or read periodicals like the traditional branch. Early in the campaign, I suggested that we try to brand the library differently, and I suggested that we call it the Library and Learning Center. Branding is the beginning of a successful fundraising campaign because it differentiates you from every other similar campaign. So people would ask, what's a library and learning center? And initially, this idea was embraced by the steering committee of the library project instantly. It became instantly the Library and Learning Center. And the way I described it was, we're going to be employing cutting-edge technology. We're going to be including all kinds of resources that are not identified with the traditional library. This is a place where people will learn in new ways. And so why not give it that kind of label? That was before the idea of the consortium.
And it was an attention getter. I can see that.
It was definitely an attention getter because we rebranded. Every new major donor would ask, well, what do you mean by library and learning center? That was a rebranding that would differentiate us from any traditional local branch library rebuilding campaign. And then what happened was somewhere along the way, we have the exact dates. In fact, I can tell you the specific date because of what came out of a meeting. We had a meeting where there was a presentation by a representative of the Lawrence Hall of Science who came up with some ideas about some programs that the Lawrence Hall could cooperate with the library with. The suggestion had been made by Roger Falco, a professor at Berkeley, a very active leader in the community, member of the school board, and a board member of the Lawrence Hall of Science, saying, why don't we see if we can get the Lawrence Hall of Science involved with this? Well, I was at this meeting where the presentation was made by the representative from the Lawrence Hall, and I had an epiphany. And I said at the meeting, think of this. What if we were to assemble all of the great cultural and educational institutions in the region and see if we could create for them a venue at the Lafayette Library and Learning Center where their programs would be offered, where their resources would be available to us. What if we tried to create a consortium of Bay Area institutions? And that would really build on our learning center idea. And everyone sort of looked a little bit taken aback by, well, what could this be? And I said, let me think about it. But, I mean, obviously, you react to something like that, the epiphany. Maybe there's a germ of something there. I went home and I was, as I sometimes have become in the past, I perseverated about this and wrote a thought piece that night, through the night, and sent that for reactions to Gwen Lennox, saying, what do you think? Gwen came back with a couple of suggestions, and within 24 hours, I circulated this one-pager to the library campaign. They loved it and authorized me, asked me to go out and organize it. I came up with a list of about 15, 16, 17 organizations, all of which had been grantees of the San Francisco Foundation and whose CEOs were my personal friends.
Yes.
So I could call Craig Franz at St. Mary's and Charlie Glasser at John F. Kennedy University and Elizabeth Stage at the Lawrence Hall and Joel Parrott at the Oakland Zoo, and so it went. What happened was that, and in fact, in some cases, and you have the documentation, when I called Eunice Valentine at the Lindsay Museum, she said, Bob, that sounds neat. Will you write me a letter that could be sent out over my name back to you, expressing my interest? Well, in fact, as it turned out, I probably wrote half or three-quarters of all the little letters from people like Dennis Power at the Oakland Museum and Tom Steinbeck at Greenbelt Alliance, thinking that these letters of excitement and enthusiasm and agreement to join the consortium would become fundraising tools for us.
Indeed.
When we went out
Indeed.
to the foundation community and the major gifts community, because after all, when you think about the strategy, if the Oakland Museum becomes part of the Lafayette Library and Learning Center, their major donors, especially those who reside in the La Miranda area, become our major donor prospects.
I see.
If the Lawrence Hall of Science or the Lindsay Museum or St. Mary's College become part of the Lafayette, their major donors become part of our donor prospect pool, and these letters became very important. The bottom line on all of that, Nancy, was that with the exception of the journalism school, where I won't mention Orville's name, was too cowardly to make that commitment, I was able to ring in everyone I invited into the consortium. Clearly the excitement over the consortium built in the library leadership because it was very exciting. And then we began to see some new possibilities, and I'm going to give Steve Falk a lot of credit for this. Steve had always carried this idea about the desirability of naming something in Lafayette after Glenn Seaborg. It's a way of branding the community of Lafayette.
Indeed.
Just as my hope when I created La Concord d'Elegance in 1970 was to brand Lafayette as the kind of place like Pebble Beach or Silverado that could host a Concord d'Elegance or Hillsborough. Steve had always wanted to do something with the Glenn Seaborg name, and of course he was principally responsible with meetings we had with David Seaborg and Helen Seaborg. They were old friends of mine, to get the Seaborg family to give us the Glenn Seaborg name for the consortium. And Steve was also a key in the effort we made to get national library journals to feature the concept of the Lafayette Library and Learning Center. A lot of this work was through a relationship we developed with a woman named Diana Shull at American Libraries for the Future, who was very supportive of this. So we got major articles, major involvement by other institutions, and then we could take this to donor prospects.
Indeed. Yes, amazing, amazing.
And I think, going back to your original question, it was the big idea.
It was the big idea, indeed. Outcomes and the future of the library. What do you hope will be the outcome for the people of the community? What do you look forward to doing or enjoying the most at the new library?
I am very excited about it. Gloria Duffy, who is the president of the Commonwealth Club, which is one of the consortium partners, is an old Lafayetteer who was active. She was actually one of the chairs of my political campaigns all those many years ago, and was a key in creating the Lafayette Youth Commission back around 1970 or 71. Gloria Duffy has already brought a variety of Commonwealth Club programs to Lafayette and is beginning creating the environment for excitement when the other consortium members become increasingly involved. So I do think that the consortium is going to be a success. I think that the library is going to be a model library with its collections, with its access to collections throughout the county, and with its use of technology. It's going to be a very friendly, beautiful, warm, attractive space with its craftsman style architecture that really suits Lafayette. There's going to be ample parking. It's really a civic building and program that will be an expression of Lafayette's highest aspirations. The new community room will, and as well as the outdoor gathering areas, I think are going to be used very heavily. If I live long enough, I wouldn't mind my memorial services being in that community room, because for me, and I'm going to be buried up on Boot Hill in Lafayette at the east end of town. So I see it as a place that's like the Veterans Building, going to become very important to us. And of course, we go back to our basics. It's going to be a place where we can bring our children when they're 2 and 3 years old, and where we can chauffeur our children when they get into elementary school, and before they can chauffeur themselves in high school. That's going to be a great resource to them. So I'm very, very excited about it. And of course, the campaign has energized not only the volunteer community, but the leadership and donor community in Lafayette. And it's just a platform for the future.
I certainly agree with all of those words, and what you've said suggests that this will be a true enhancement to what already exists in Lafayette.
A major resource, and we can't forget that it's been a true partnership. The money that we raised, 12 plus million for capital, the additional money that was raised after, another $2-3 million for endowment, the partnership of the state, where we, thanks to the leadership of Steve Falk, were able to win this major state library grant of over $11 million. Plus, Steve Falk's incredible creativity in finding the bonding solutions and the redevelopment monies solutions with the help of Don Tatson and the City Council to fund what is now a 45 plus or minus $1 million civic center
Incredible.
is incredible.
Yeah, it's incredible. And
So it's
aren't we
been a
lucky?
true partnership. We are lucky, but we're also,
But it was hard work.
it's like going back to the way in which I responded to your question about my educational opportunities. We're all presented with opportunities, but the human condition doesn't enable us always to take advantage of those opportunities. And here's a perfect example of where opportunity knocked and the community really made it
Responded.
happen.
Yes. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your wisdom, your words with us today. We so much appreciate it.
Thank you, Nancy.
And good wishes to
Thank you very much for doing this oral history project.